Again, to put it into a modern context, we have roughly 25,000 students here at LGNU. But in terms of student intake, we're the seventh largest intake of students into STEM in all higher education institutions within the UK. Now, you may say, why is that relevant? Well, it's relevant from the point of view that if we don't have an appropriate balance, if we don't have equality, if we don't have balance in gender, and yet we are so embedded within the areas of STEM, then it means almost by definition, the direct implication would be that actually as an institution, a large institution and a proud institution, then we're not demonstrating and we're not discharging our responsibility as an institution that recognises equality. So the topic of this lecture series and the topic of the lecture this afternoon is very dear to our heart. And it is equality in STEM. Encouraging more to come into STEM is a key strategic aim for us as a university. And I think many of you will know more recently Professor Robin Leatherbarrow, as Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Knowledge Transfer, has taken on the responsibility as a member of the senior team to encourage equality, take all the necessary steps to ensure that our policies, our practices, our procedures, the way we behave, our culture represent and should encourage equality in the student base and also in the staff base. And I'm very grateful to Robin and Moni, who's here, who have been at the forefront in ensuring that the university earlier this year was awarded the Athena Swan Bronze Award. And we have that now at an institutional level, and that was collected by the team just a couple of weeks ago. And that is just one small but important step that we've made. And we want to build on this. And at institutional level we have that award, but now we want to take it down to school level, to division and department level, and make sure that we're really proactive in achieving that award across the institution and within the institution. So, just with those words of introduction, I hope you realise that as an institution it is a high strategic priority for us, and certainly as Vice-Chancellor I'm absolutely delighted about this lecture series that has been started about women in STEM. We will have the inaugural lecture in a moment, but I'm asked also to indicate that we already have the second lecturer lined up, the Vice-Chancellor rather, the Vice-Chancellor of Brunel University, or Brunel London University as I think it's been renamed recently, Professor Julia Buckingham, who will be coming and talking to us later on. So this is an activity we want to continue. This is an activity, a lecture series we want to embed within our academic calendar and again bring together so many people to talk and debate these key issues. So it's with great pleasure and privilege that I'd like to introduce our distinguished guest and speaker this afternoon, Mr. Andrew Miller, MP. Andrew has a distinguished career in Parliament, and before that, we were just hearing a few minutes ago, also a distinguished background in science and technology. He's also chair of the influential Parliamentary Committee on Science, and often we see these clips on TV where you have, I would guess, rather the daunting pleasure and challenge of quizzing top scientists, but also top ministers, even prime ministers and the like about science policy. So thank you very much indeed, Andrew, for taking time out to give this inaugural lecture. We do appreciate how busy you are, and we all very much look forward to the lecture this afternoon. So can we welcome Mr. Andrew Miller.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's the first time I've been in this fantastic building. A little bit echoey wherever the sound man is, but I'm sure it'll sort itself out. Will it? that one. That's the problem. Thanks very much. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this inaugural lecture. I think it's a hugely important subject, and it's a real pleasure to be here and encouraged to see so many people taking an interest in this series of lectures. For those of you not aware, the House of Commons Science and Technology Select Committee is a committee of MPs with the remit to scrutinise government and its relationship with science. Formally, our role is to keep an eye on the Government Office for Science, or GoScience as it's known. Yes. It was it. I think you're not the only one. I can tell you it's echoing in my ear as well. As it's, I can probably do it without it, but it's probably better. Aha. Yeah. There we are. Try that. Is that better for you? Yeah. It's better for me as well. Okay. Thanks very much. So our role is to scrutinise the work of GoScience, but because scientific decision making goes, we hope, everywhere inside the government machinery, we have a broad remit to look right across the activities of government and examine the activities of all of the key government departments whose policies make use of or have implications for science, engineering and technology. Now, I might be accused of being a bit biased. I'm convinced that this broad remit makes our committee one of the most interesting to work on. The cross-cutting nature of our scrutiny and the freedom to cast our gaze across numerous departments has enabled us to have an impact on a wide range of policy areas. Ahead of the next general election, which nominally is the first Thursday in May of next year, people say that's absolutely fixed in tablets of stone. Well, technically it is, but watch this space. It could be earlier, it could technically be later. But ahead of that next general election, we are starting a legacy study to look back at the work we've done over the last 5 years, look at the recommendations in the 30 or so reports we've published during this Parliament, and whilst I don't want to preempt the findings of that final report, I've been particularly pleased to see the positive way in which so many institutions have responded to the report we published earlier this year on women in scientific careers. And it's that report which will inform my talk to you today. What I plan to do is give you an overview of some of the serious issues that our inquiry highlighted, and perhaps unusually for an opposition politician, I want to offer a note of optimism and talk about some of the initiatives that now take place to tackle. Many of those initiatives are very much in their infancy, and there's certainly a lot more that governments, HE institutions and research councils could be doing to progress the careers of underrepresented groups in STEM. But I do think that the spotlight cast by our inquiry is stimulating some action. There's a groundswell of concern at the moment, and I know that this university has been making great strides in improving its support for women's career development in STEM subjects. I was delighted to hear about the Athena Swan. I look forward to coming back sometime in the future and hearing about silver and gold, Nigel. Our inquiry began in June of 2013, following the publication by the Department of Business of a report called Women in the Workplace. So we announced a complementary inquiry looking at women in STEM careers, and we had specific focus on the retention of women in academic STEM careers. We were careful to look at the role of universities and the government, and we wanted to ensure that there was a means of encouraging a diverse gender mix to enter and, more importantly, remain in STEM positions. Our report was based on over 90 written submissions and oral evidence from some 13 witnesses. They included members of the UK academic community, diversity and equality groups, universities, funding bodies, and the government. Some of you here today, I know, contributed to our inquiry, and I'm grateful for your input. And that's a point I make very strongly to any audience that's looking at this interface between science and policy. Make your input, because you can make a difference. Many attempts have been made to improve the underrepresentation of women in science. Progress has, however, been somewhat slow. We still see what's been termed the leaking pipeline, namely the loss of women at the early stages of their careers following postgraduate training. It may sound encouraging that after years of effort to adjust science's gender balance, women constitute 44.5% of all academic staff in the United Kingdom. Encouraging until you read that only 17% of professors in STEM subjects are women. And I think the whole of the audience ought to agree that that's unacceptable. By way of comparison, just so that we are trying to make a fair comparison, there's a higher percentage of women in the House of Commons than there are women professors in STEM. We have the appallingly low figure of 23%. You have the appallingly low figure of 17%. Over the course of our inquiry, it became apparent that there was no single explanation for the lack of gender diversity in STEM. It was the result of perceptions and biases on top of the impracticalities of combining a career with family. Current working patterns were identified as particularly problematic. We heard evidence that STEM careers in academia are often viewed as all-consuming and overwhelmingly competitive. And this created a perception that it's impossible to participate in science on anything other than a completely immersive basis. While I understand that scientific research cannot always take place within normal working hours, ideas come from in the most unlikely places. When success is measured primarily by output, there is pressure to clock up hours far beyond contractual obligations. Little, if any, time is left for life outside work, and this status quo particularly disadvantages academics with caring responsibilities, which of course tends to apply disproportionately to women. Early academic STEM careers are also characterised by instability and insecurity. Postdoctoral researchers are invariably employed under a series of short-term contracts. While these encourage mobility, they are ultimately a barrier to job security and continuity of employment rights. That also makes it difficult for young female scientists to combine a career with family. And since women tend to be the primary carers, they are more likely than men to end their STEM careers at this point. A vicious cycle then sets in. The lack of successful female role models, particularly those with families, heightens the perception among young academics that to succeed in a STEM career, women have to be superhuman. Many of the ones I know are. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this discourages many women from staying. And it also perpetuates the stereotype of STEM subjects being a masculine pursuit which can deter school-age girls from pursuing science subjects. The insecurity of short-term contracts is often compounded by the ongoing pressure to obtain multiple research grants. And the evidence shows that women are less likely than men to apply for funding. When they do apply, it's for smaller amounts, shorter durations than their male colleagues. My committee also heard that women are minimally, but nevertheless systematically less successful than men in being awarded a grant, even in fields where they're well represented, such as in life sciences. So grant-giving bodies tend to respond to much more pushy approaches. It was the suggestion that came out of that evidence. We've recently seen as a prime example of this, in September, the Royal Society announced the latest group of researchers to be awarded university research fellowships. These prestigious prizes give at least 5 years funding to scientists in the early stages of their career who have been seen to have the potential to become leaders in their field. This year, out of the 43 research fellowships awarded, only 2 went to women, to whom the security would have been less disproportionately useful. Now, I know that Sir Paul Nurse has launched an inquiry into this gender imbalance. Gender biases in STEM are likely to be largely unconscious rather than intentional. While scientists are rigorously trained to be objective, they are susceptible to the same unconscious gender biases as the rest of the population. These biases are held both by men and women, and it's unfortunate that some are unwilling to accept this simply because their professional research requires them to be objective. I suspect none of what I've described will come as any surprise to the audience. I don't think anyone here would see these career structures and working patterns as sustainable over the long run. A lack of diversity across the scientific community represents a loss of large potential talent to the UK. Not only does this limit UK's competitiveness and prosperity, it also curbs the vitality and creativity of the wider scientific workforce. The practicalities of developing an academic career, the difficulties of securing funding, the pressure to publish, the instability of short-term contracts, all these matters tend to have a disproportionate effect on women. We recognise this, and many of the recommendations in our report are targeted at delivering changes to benefit women in academia. That's not to say that men and their families are also adversely affected by many of the same difficulties, which is why our report highlights the need to have a much more holistic approach to tackling gender diversity in STEM. Competitiveness for jobs is certainly beneficial for science. However, careers should not be constructed in such a way that talented women and men are deterred from remaining and progressing in STEM. Arguably, we're still living with an academic career system that was developed when most of the faculty members were men, and those were men who could relocate to available research posts when they became available. So, where does the responsibility for change lie? Well, universities and other HE institutions are employers of academic STEM researchers. They're responsible for employment conditions, and they hold the power to drive through changes that will improve the lives of their staff. However, it tends to be principal investigators, the senior academics amongst postdocs and other research staff, who shape the working culture of research groups. The problem arises with those universities that adopt a laissez-faire approach and do not take an active interest in how principal investigators manage their researchers. Universities need to address their responsibilities as employers. In our report, we criticised the culture of unreasonably long hours, working hours in science. We called on HE institutions to review the working hours of their academic staff. Crucially, we also recommended that line managers, directly or indirectly, who pressure staff into working excess hours, should be held to account by their employer. Principal investigators may benefit from training that gives them the tools to be good managers, who take responsibility for the well-being and development of their research staff. And I've seen this both in industry and academia and in other sectors beyond STEM, where people have become promoted to leading roles but haven't had any training in people management skills. It's not something that comes off the shelf. To tackle the unconscious gender bias that can impact upon women accessing funding, obtaining publications, securing promotion, and so on, it's essential that good quality diversity and equality training is provided. And again, this is where I think the SWAN comes into the machinery. We recommended that training be compulsory for all members of recruitment and promotion panels for STEM jobs in HE institutions, as well as all line managers of academic staff. Now, there's also a problem of role models. Often, successful women academics are those who've made the decision to put their career before personal life. Whilst that has to be admired, there are some amazing women that have nevertheless managed to do both. Young women scientists look at these role models and think, perhaps it's not for me. There needs to be a message that career in science does not preclude a healthy work-life balance. Universities need to emphasise male and female role models who have successfully combined their career with other commitments outside of work. In addition to role models, we heard repeatedly that there's strong support for mentoring schemes, and that mentoring encourages women to apply for promotions and other opportunities. We recommended that HEIs and other STEM employers should implement mentoring schemes for all staff, with particular attention paid towards mentoring for women and other groups that are underrepresented at senior levels. There is a risk that these kind of interventions could be seen as sort of fiddling while Rome burns, but I don't think that's a fair assertion. Examined individually, our recommendations might appear to propose very, very small changes, yet small incremental differences at every stage of the STEM career add up to significant differences that by retirement should make a real difference and improve the working lives for everyone for the better. So universities should do more to keep women in science. There's a clear need for the HE sector to take a hard look at itself and review the academic career structure. Well-educated, highly skilled female scientists are an asset, one that we cannot afford to waste at a time when the UK economy needs more STEM workers than it's currently producing. Universities, however, don't operate in a vacuum. Responsibility for change also rests with the government and the research councils. It was therefore disappointing to find that funding from the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills for diversity programmes fell in real terms from approximately 6 million in 2008-09 to 2.4 million in 14-15. Hardest hit by the cuts was the UK Resource Centre for Women in Science, Engineering and Technology. The centre provided practical support for girls and women in science, engineering and technology, including those thinking of a career in these fields. And following the 2010 spending review, funding for the centre was not renewed and it ended in April 2011. But notwithstanding those cuts, we were actually encouraged by the government's response to our report and their agreement with the vast majority of our recommendations. Increasing reach and impact of efforts to encourage diversity in STEM was identified by the government as a priority, and I'm happy to report that some progress is underway. The major speech was delivered by one of the ministers, Nicky Morgan, earlier on this week, which hints of some positive changes. For example, through the Higher Education Funding Council for England and Universities UK, the government has committed to looking at existing diversity and equality training. Where necessary, it plans to use its influence to drive improvements. Other commitments include funding the Daphne Jackson Trust, carrying out a feasibility study into extending its fellowships model into industry as well. A major initiative led by the government has also been announced, and again that's referred to in Nicky Morgan's speech, the Your Life campaign, which asks organisations to work together to boost female participation in technology and engineering. It provides a core set of principles to help to ensure the widest range of young people are inspired by science and can see the value and opportunity of studying STEM subjects. The campaign also focuses on reducing barriers to pursuing a career involving science. It was launched, you may remember, there was a covered on television by the Chancellor of the Science Museum in May, and so far over 180 businesses and academic institutions have signed up. Difficult to say this as an opposition politician, but I actually welcome the government's words in its apparent commitment to improving gender diversity in STEM subjects. However, I'm also struck by the feeling that we've been here before. Now, our inquiry, we didn't expect it to, it didn't unearth anything terribly new. What it showed was, it highlighted that problems and solutions have been identified for a long time, they've been understood, but sadly action has not been forthcoming. Our predecessor committee in 2002, for example, called for more to be done to balance the benefits of short-term contracts with the needs of postdoctoral researchers. And I'm disappointed that not more has been done to achieve this over the last 12 years. But I want to finish on a slightly more optimistic note. I'm encouraged by the sheer amount of interest and work that's currently being undertaken on this matter. That's occurring within and outside government and the higher education sector. It's positive to see organisations like the British Science Association using their annual conference to discuss how to publicise the work of women already in STEM subjects and how to encourage those girls and women who are thinking of joining them. Improving gender diversity in STEM certainly has gathered momentum recently. And I'm hopeful that we're reaching a critical juncture in which the changes I've outlined this afternoon will start to materialise. Now, however, is the time not to be complacent. And this, of course, is where you come in. We've heard during our inquiry that some universities were making great strides in implementing diversity programmes and were successfully challenging deeply embedded gender biases. This needs to continue, and we certainly welcome these pockets of excellence. We also want to hear more about them. Now, my committee and I rely on skilled individuals like you to help to provide the evidence on which government policies should be based. And as our legacy inquiry begins, and we start to follow up our recommendations, we need you to reflect on where progress in retaining women in scientific careers has been made, telling us what is working, and also telling us where more needs to be done. And any evidence that comes forward that will be taken very seriously. As some of you know, I'm now coming to the end of my period of office as chairman of the Science and Technology Select Committee. Indeed, as my time as a member of Parliament, as I'm intending to step down at the next general election. Now, as an MP, I've had the privilege of regularly meeting with eminent scientists, with young enthusiastic researchers, with a keen sense of curiosity, and I've also seen facilities like the National Schools Observatory established by this university, and how it can inspire children by enabling them to experience real-world applications of science and technology. These people make me optimistic about the future of British science. Our potential to continually advance the boundaries of knowledge is huge. Getting to the point where there's real diversity in scientific careers will require leadership and the coordination of efforts across the HE sector. This doesn't mean any more big launches, big new initiatives. Success depends on sustained leadership and commitment, even where it's expensive and difficult. Without leadership and perseverance, the systematic discrimination apparent in STEM academic careers will continue. It will damage the lives and prospects of Britain's talented scientists, and it will also damage British science. Nobody wants this, so now's the time to act to prevent it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's a great honour and it's a privilege to be addressed by someone that has taken as much time and is as knowledgeable about the subject as you are. And we really appreciate that you should come to Liverpool to tell us more about this subject. I am sure that you would be delighted to take questions from the audience. So,
during your lecture, you mentioned that universities should be more government-specific managed, but at the same time, you also mentioned Royal Society's recent awards like Silver Women. So, what is the government or the university? It's a chicken and egg situation. If they don't get funding, they don't stay in the academia and the universities to continue the contract. So, has committee made any recommendation, or looking at the way out of it? What should be the funding review committee members should look at actually when they are considering the medicine science?
Well, starting with your observations about the Royal Society, I'm a great fan of the Royal Society, and I think Paul Nurse is one of the most inspiring leaders that they've had for many generations. And Paul has recognised that there's a serious problem, which is why he's announced his internal inquiry into how did that happen. It cannot be the case that only 2 out of 43 should fit into the category of being deserving for fellowships. So he's doing his bit. We've made some fairly blunt challenges to research councils about some of the issues around grant applications I managed. I've made observations about universities, I've made observations about government. The one thing that is for certain is that there is not a single quick fix. This is a team effort that we all must work on. And I'm absolutely serious when I say that failing to do that is not just a disservice to an individual woman scientist, it's actually a massive disservice to UK PLC. It will damage the future prosperity of this country if we don't get that team working together. So we were discussing earlier on with the Vice-Chancellor things that start at primary schools. How do you take out stereotyping in everything from the playground through the way children are taught. It starts at a very, very young age. needs to be continued at every level. Everyone's saying, oh, well, that's such a small drop in the ocean, it's not going to make any difference. But I sort of liken it to the debate about climate change. You know, every one of our actions collectively makes a difference, and this is a classic example. We've all got a role to play. It's me with my grandchildren now, or it's you with your students. We've all got a role to play, and make sure that those institutional organisations that have historically not been as effective as they could be, change their attitudes, push hard, don't give up.
If I must add in that, I agree with you. I'm a great fan of Royal Society. They funded me for 6 years on one of the fellowship, but I think it is the situation where the review, the funding applications goes to peers, and if there aren't any women there, or if they aren't encouraging them, then probably it becomes a roundabout situation.
Which is why I was quite blunt about saying that there is a need for diversity and HR training to get into those senior researchers. That's, I think, quite critical. You know, all of us that become specialists in any job we do always need to keep a focus on how the whole team around us works. And, you know, we saw this in the health service, didn't we, when people took their eye off the ball on cleaning, something as simple as cleaning. We put it out to contract because it's not a core activity. Of course it's a core activity. It determines whether it's safe to be in that hospital ward. So you need a management system that does look holistically at the whole problem. And I think at the core of this argument, that's the trick we've got to pull off. We've got to get systems that do look at the complete being.
Thank you. Colette Fagan, University of Manchester, and member of the Athena Steering Group. I welcome the report and all the good work that the committee's done over the years. But I would suggest one of the things you might want to look, and we could all look at as we push forward for action, is a comparison between STEM and non-STEM subjects and differences within STEM, so that we move forward a better understanding of structures and cultures and how they interact. So we do have better presence of women in some bits of science. Applied sciences, nursing is the obvious area, but certain areas of medicine. And if we look at other areas, arts and social sciences, women's representation has improved and has improved more quickly. And actually, when you compare, yes, there are differences in our academic practices. STEM scientists don't work longer hours, they don't work harder, they don't have more insecure contracts. There are differences in practice, but that's not the whole story. And so I would suggest that one of the ways of progressing this in organisations is to do some drilling down about how culture, unconscious bias, not just in the team leaders, but in your co-workers, and indeed expectations, vary in different bits of the university and create some of these more intractable but very real barriers that women face in some areas of science and some areas of academic practice more generally.
I think it's an extremely important observation, and I look forward to Athena Swan's formal presentation to our legacy report, because I think it's that kind of observation that will help the next generation of my committee look at how we can measure whether success is being achieved or not. And I think comparisons with other disciplines, indeed comparisons with other countries, it provides some useful evidence for us to work with. And if Athena Swan have got any useful data on that, we would seriously welcome it. I'm sure we are. They are very good, let me tell you, about leading on this.
Hi, I'm Liz Whitfield from LJMU Geography. I'd like to ask what you think about actually encouraging women who are not necessarily entering STEM subjects or oppositely, you know, at the end of their career or senior. I think from my position there's there's almost a gap in the middle. When you've got young females coming through doing PhDs and postdocs, you're saying that they're looking up to the senior team and saying, well, rightly or wrongly, that's not a decision I want to take because they might not have the balance. But what do you think about having role models somewhere mid-career? Because that's really where it's getting difficult to continue career development, isn't it? Particularly for ladies who might want to take maternity leave. So keeping going in that central part is really quite difficult. And what do you think about if we had more role models in that stage? Do you think that would encourage the retention of younger postdocs and postgraduates?
I think I spent 15 years of my life not directly in science, but working in HR. And I think in any successful organisation, mentoring and role models have a hugely important function. And it seems like the very soft end of HR, it doesn't really matter. And there's a tendency to discount it because of that. But actually, over a period of time, companies in particular, my knowledge of how the corporate sector works in manufacturing, particularly around the Northwest, is quite extensive. My experience tells me those companies that are genuinely successful have got that softer end of their HR system working very, very effectively, and it does make a difference. Now, can we apply it to universities? Why not? Can we apply it to every public sector job? Why not? I just think there are things that we rather take for granted because it looks so darned obvious that we tend to ignore it as a priority.
Take a question over there.
It's just to follow up on that point, really. Sorry, I'm Sarah from Aston University. Many of the fellowships that are specifically designed to enable flexible working and care and responsibilities, I'm thinking specifically of the Dorothy Hodgkin one because that's the one that I'm working with at the moment. The timing is such that it's actually very difficult to complete a PhD, do a postdoc, get a first academic position, spend a year or two getting yourself established, then have a baby, and then still be eligible to apply. The windows are too tight. I think there would be huge value in extending the windows for the specific funding fellowships that are opened for people with care and responsibilities. I know it's not something you have direct influence over, but I thought it's worth flagging it.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation, and of course that doesn't simply apply to women, and it isn't just about bringing up children, and there are some countries where childcare responsibilities are on a statutory basis divided. Denmark's a good example of where one sees good practice. But actually there are similar problems in some other areas. Anyone here from the School of Tropical Medicine? No, that's only just over there. But that's because a good chunk of their senior researchers are out of country working in the field, literally saving lives on a daily basis, and therefore can't prioritise writing papers. And I think that, again, somebody needs to have a rethink about how in each discipline you treat career progression, and in that example, how do you measure the work that's being done in the field to save lives versus the fact that there's an absent paper in a learning journal. So it does cover a very wide range of people, and it's certainly, I think one of the key changes that we need to make structurally in terms of caring responsibilities is to look at some of the other models, such as the Danish one, where there is a much clearer statutory right for men and women to bring up their children and give them the start they deserve.
Hello,
Hello, hi, Sally Warnes from Edghill University. In terms of the universities to do want to keep women in science, would it be a good way to kind of look at exemplar case studies of, you know, successful women, and if, you know, share their journey and how they've managed to achieve what they've managed to achieve, and share that with people who are maybe looking at careers in scientific careers in universities, and maybe do a kind of a timeline, a plan, so that they're more guided, you know, in terms of rather, oh crikey, I won't go to university, it's a bit too you know, a bit scary that, I don't know how I'll progress. It will maybe allay some of their fears if they saw some examples, and maybe there was a structure for them to actually follow. It was more guided in a bigger sense, you know, a 5-year plan, here's your 5-year career plan.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd want a formal structure there that you sat down and created your 5-year plan. It sounds a bit Soviet, but coming back to the question down here, that softer end of guidance that comes in good HR systems, it would, in a sense, help people. You know, why don't you go and talk to so-and-so in the lab just down the corridor, she's in a similar situation to you, or he's in a similar situation to you, before you call the shots on choices that come along in the career path. And I think that's the where I would like to see people do. But again, that presupposes a higher degree of ability amongst leaders of research programs than exists broadly today.
Okay, I'm just wondering if people actually are put off applying for positions in the science, women in science in the universities. Is it worth, you know, looking at how the positions are promoted to people that are successful in science in other areas to attract them, and then hopefully then retain them?
Well, again, that comes back to the point that the woman from Manchester made about the Athena Swan stuff. There are exemplars that you can take out of other sectors and ask yourself the question, why can't it be applied to this sector? What are the obstacles, and let's compare and contrast. And I think there's some value in following that line of thinking.
Hi, I'm Hazel Nichols from John Moores University. One of the things that I've noticed about funding bodies, over the past few years, they seem to be focusing more on offering larger grants which last for longer, which I can see is good in terms of job security. But you said earlier that women tend not to apply for larger grants. Might encouraging more smaller grants actually help women, I guess partly to gain confidence if you apply for a small grant and you get it, and perhaps your confidence is boosted?
I think this is fraught with difficulties. I'm sure there's somebody in the audience who's on a 5-year contract and has tried to apply for a mortgage. Building societies don't like that sort of contractual relationship. And however much you plead that this will roll on to further contracts, it's really so. The short-termism has structural problems that the whole of society is facing. I mean, there are lots and lots of people outside this hall in Liverpool working on 0-hour contracts, having exactly the same problems impacting upon them. In terms of the relationship with grant bodies, the evidence was I have to say I was quite surprised at it. Whether it's because my daughter is more pushy than the average or not, but I don't know. But the evidence was overwhelming that women do not push as hard as men do in that area, dealing with the grant bodies. And that's got to be dealt with, whatever system of grants you have. There has to be greater equity and applications based on merit rather than how loud you can shout.
Okay, I'm aware that time is pressing on. I suggest that we take one final question and then we finally let Andrew get on his way.
Thank you. Denise Eaton, Liaison Coordinator from Sheffield Hallam University. It's just really building on from the last question. We found in our experience at Sheffield Hallam that women will apply for professorships, but if they are not black, they don't apply again. Whereas in our experience, men will apply until they are successful. And we have been doing some work in Sheffield Hallam to specifically mentor programs for women who are thinking of aspiring to professorships, to encourage them to put a good first application, but then a second, even better application if they're not successful first time.
Well, I think there's a strong message there. Men are rather good at boring people into submission. I hope my lecture hasn't done that today. But I think you're making a very good point. And I'm told that there are there's some industrial evidence that supports that as well. But outside of academia, men are much more likely to continue pressing away until somebody caves in. But I think that's a very good point. Quite what the answer is, again, comes back to looking inside at how appointment panels work.
It's the value of mentoring, as you said. I think it's shown.
Okay, I think we could easily carry on for a long time afterwards. I am sure that Andrew will be very happy to field some private questions, but I'm aware that people need to get off. And I would like to wrap up by thanking a series of people. First and foremost, thanking Andrew for a fascinating talk and for a really interesting question and answer session. Secondly, as is apparent in the questions and answers, we have attracted a range of people from not just John Moores University, but from quite far afield. And I welcome your interest in this, and I thank you very much for that. And I will invite you to come back into some of our future events in this area. And we had highlighted that Julia Buckingham, who is one of the very few vice-chancellors with a STEM background, will be talking about the challenges that she faced and how obviously in her case at least, that was overcome. I'd like to thank our Vice-Chancellor for opening our event. I think that his presence here shows how important the equality and the diversity and the gender diversity issue is throughout the senior team at Liverpool John Moores. We have some other people to thank. The HR division is responsible for providing lunch, and that's a very important thing. We thank them for that. There are various people around. We have the event team, the student coordinators, people from the students from the Screen School, corporate comms, technicians that have been sorting out some of the buzzing microphones. Thank them for all their help in putting this together. And of course to Moni, who, hiding at the back, typical. Moni did all the organisation for this, and she really does deserve some thanks. So perhaps if we can collectively thank all of these people in the traditional manner.